Paul is that he has no idea, he is unable to use the words to share what was seen, right? And the question is, why is that, right? If God was giving this vision to Paul or whoever this person was, why? And the answer is in here. He moves on and he says this, and it's so important, 2 Corinthians. He says this, in behalf of this man I will boast, but not on my own half, except for my own weaknesses, though if I should boast, I would not be a fool, because I'm speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think of me more than he sees me or hears of me. He doesn't want people to think that he's bigger than his britches, right? The reason God gave Paul, or whoever this person was, the vision is the same reason Jesus gave John the vision in Revelation. Right? And you're like, that's weird. That's completely out of left field. Sort of. We got a little bit distracted by a fire alarm and somebody really eager for lunch. Over in Revelation, there's some really neat parallels to what Paul sees right here. Because what happens is, you see, when John writes Revelation, he's hanging out on the island of Patmos, and an angel shows up with a pen and a paper, click, and he says, you need to write this down. And he's like, and John's like, am I going to understand it? And the angel's like, nope, but write it down anyways. Right? And what happens is John just starts writing in Revelation, and he's doing the best that he can, but he just does not know. And here's the thing, regardless of what your position is in the book of Revelation, who it's written to, where it's written, when it's written, if the rapture happens or not, how right Kirk Cameron and Tim LaHaye are, right? You don't know everything about Revelation because it's confusing and at some points off-putting, but it always worships Jesus. The other thing that's really neat in Revelation is the book of Revelation is that there's several parts where the angel says to John, stop writing and just watch and experience the moment, right? And what we learn about Revelation is we learn the same thing about the revelation that God gives to most likely Paul, possibly somebody else. It's given to bring attention not to John, not to Paul, but to himself, all right? The book of Revelation, the primary thing you can get out of the book of Revelation is you get to learn about Jesus and how he's the great king. There's stuff about the end times. However, the point of Revelation is that Jesus is our great king. The point of Paul's revelation that he cannot share with us because he's not able to and not allowed to is that Jesus is good. Jesus is God. So what Paul's bragging on here isn't anything he's good at. It's how good God is, right? As your pastor, the only thing I can brag on is how good God is, how good Jesus is. Right? So what does that mean for us now? Well, let's take a look at this. There's two things that we can learn based on the idea that everything good comes from God. First off, it's this, right? All gifts come from God. So you say, all right, well, that's good. Revelations certainly are good, and they're certainly from God. You can only brag on that, but here's the thing, right? I am super good in the paint. I'm great at basketball, so I can brag on that, right? Well, yes and no, right? James says this, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change, right? The idea is, and we're not calling anybody out, I know we got some ball players here, if you're good at basketball, that's because God made you to be good at basketball. Well, you don't understand. I spent, 3 hours a day playing, doing layups and practicing my foul line shot over and over and over again. Yeah, God allowed you to do that, right? That's the thing. We are only good at things because God makes us able to do that. It's a real thing. I've seen a lot of people try and learn how to play guitar. And the deal is, regardless of how good you are or not, if you're going to be good at it or not, you got to have a knack for it. Same thing with percussion. I've learned the hard way. Right? Absolutely. Whatever talents you have, whatever goodness you have, ultimately comes from your great creator, the gift giver, God. And as such, I can't brag on my own talents outside of God, because it would be like my kids bragging on the fact that they live in their house without recognizing me. Did they do anything to get in that house? They were born. That's kind of it. Secondly, you look at the reason God gives us gifts. It moves on, and we say, okay, so we glorify God with with our power, our ability to do stuff. So does that mean I can just thank God and go about my business, right? I'm good at basketball. I say, thanks for that, God, right? If I'm in the NBA, I do this number or that number, or right? And that's it, right? And the answer is no, because then the question becomes, why did God give you that gift? Well, let me answer it with this, right? Ephesians 4:15 and 16, it says this, rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, with whom the whole body, joined together and held together with every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, talking about those gifts, makes the body grow so it builds itself up in love. The reason you're given gifts, whatever those things are, the reason you're given your personality, whether you're a history buff or you put your foot in your mouth a lot, right? Whether or not you're really into sports or really love video games and get super excited in early June because that's when E3 comes out, although it's less of a big deal now, right? Any of those things is God gave you those gifts so you could glorify his body in your church. I'll give a really stupid and good example, okay? Man, I really got to, oh no, I'll do a different example rather than the board game one because we do that too much. Something I really enjoy personally, a little less now, I think it's because I'm getting older, is video games. Big fan of those, right? I don't know why, they're nice, instant gratification sometimes. Sometimes I can just sit down, have a long day, do this thing, and my mind can wander while I'm building a house, right, in Minecraft, right? What's amazing is I don't just say, thanks, God, and then spend 8 hours eating Doritos. Okay, cool. Hey, all right, we got our security team talking to the firemen. All right, great. I can't just sit from 10 at night to 6 in the morning eating Doritos and playing video games and saying that's glorifying to God, right? That's hard to make that argument, right? Getting a lot of angry stares from a very specific group of our people. But here's the thing that I can do to glorify God in that. Man, I can't tell you how many kids I've had over to my house to play Smash Brothers with. Here's the thing, nobody knows what that is, but if you know, you know. And I've built so many relationships in church and in youth group playing stupid, silly video games, right? That's how you glorify God with your gifts. Some of you guys are fantastic at basketball, and over the years, you have had a chance to share your faith through that and invite people to church through that. I know people who are at our church now because of basketball leagues that we were a part of 20 and 30 years ago. Some of you guys, I got to say this right because I always say the word wrong, are artistic in that you are a fan of the arts. There we go, got that right. Okay, fantastic. That is a wonderful thing that God gave you to glorify him in. So it's not just, thanks God, I'm going to enjoy this painting or I'm going to watch this foreign film. It's, thanks God, how can I use this for your kingdom, right? It's each member of the body working so the body itself grows up to be like Jesus in love. It's wonderful. That's what it means, okay? Because we are weak and Christ empowers us when we're weak, that means that the only thing we can brag in as Christians is Jesus. Even in the gifts that we have, whether it's an eye for business or an eye for athletics or an eye for spreadsheets, and that's a gift from the Lord, by the way, because I don't have that. All right, we can use that to glorify God, and we should thank him for it. Secondly, and we'll be very quick, all of our weaknesses glorify Jesus in the life of a Christian, verses 7 through 10. All right, so Paul moves on, and he says this, so in order to keep me from being conceited, from being full of myself, because of the surpassing greatness of revelations, there is a thorn given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan come to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Let's talk about that, right? Thorn in the flesh, who here knows what that means, right? It's usually an inopportune inconvenience that follows you and doesn't go away. Actually, what's neat is it's a phrase that's been used for thousands of years. It starts in the book of Numbers. I think God uses it in the book of Numbers, or Moses does rather, but it continues. It's the thing we do. And Paul does this thing that all of us do, and we started the sermon this way. He goes, three times I pleaded with the Lord that it should leave me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. We're going to hit pause on the sermon, and we're going to take a side note that's very important here, okay? Many of us have prayed against things in our lives that are terrible, horrible things, whether it's praying against a relationship dying or praying against a disease. And we have it. Okay? Now, this is really important because I want to make sure we set this up right for the next 7 minutes, okay? The goal of the next 7 minutes isn't to come up with a sterile, apologetic reason for God's existence in light of where you are in the world. Right? You guys ever do that? You say, like, man, I'm really struggling with doubt, and your brother and sister in Christ says, well, and they give a really academic answer, and it's technically right, but it's just cold comfort. Yeah, you're right, but man, what does that do for me? Right? Man, it's so, a really good example is, well, why do bad things happen to good people? And like the wrong answer, it's right and wrong. Well, there are no good people because of sin, so everybody deserves what they got. And you're like, yeah, that's technically right, but that doesn't help me with losing my kid in X shooting, right? We're not looking for a sterile thing right here. My goal over the next 6 minutes now is to shepherd us through where we are at in our lives to glorify God in where we are. All right? A lot of times what we run into is, man, I could glorify God if I was there, but I can't do it here. And Paul says, you want to talk about here, let's talk about here. So here's the thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what it is. I think Paul leaves it ambiguous because all of us have a thorn in the flesh, right? Most people think it could have been a couple of things. Paul, believe it or not, and this has been kind of a common theme for the past since March, Paul, believe it or not, struggled really bad with stress and internal anxiety. You can see that through his writings. A lot of times he writes against that. And a lot of guys will say, well, he's writing against that so he can really prop up and have on paper the promises of God so he can put his head on the pillow and sleep at night. And I'll tell you this, I, for one, am so thankful he did that because I need that, right? A lot of people think, well, some commentators think, well, Paul had a lot of spiritual opposition, right? And that makes sense. I mean, Paul, like about a month after he got saved, they had to lower him out of Jerusalem in a basket because his old co-workers were trying to have his head, literally, right? Other people believe it was a physical malady. Paul was known for having problems with his eyes. Over in the book of Galatians, he says, hey, I know you guys care about me a lot, and if you could, you'd pull out your own eyes and pop them in my head. Not to be weird, but so I could have good eyes again, right? But the deal is, all of us have dealt with some form or another of that, right? And all of us, on one level or the next, have asked God to remove one of those things from our life. And what God says to Paul is what God says to us, and it's what we talked about at the beginning. He says, no, because my grace is enough. There's a great Chris Tomlin song. We do it periodically. Your grace is enough, right? You know how it goes? Your grace is enough. I used to really make fun of that song because it's so simple, but that's the point of the text, right? And here's how this works, and I love it. Let me consult with my notes to make sure we're doing this right because this is important. Okay. Yep. We're good. All right. A lot of times, God allows us to walk through weaknesses, right? And let's talk about weakness, right? Because in a minute, I'm going to say you lean into Christ and obey Him even if you're weak. We're not talking about lack of skill. Some of you guys are weak at the guitar. You're not glorifying God by getting up here and just trying your best, right? You can't be like, well, I'm weak at the guitar. I've never played it. I'm going to go for it next week. And according to 2 Corinthians 12, it's going to go great. No, don't do that, please. Please don't do that, okay? All right. So a lot of times what we mean is that we're called by God to do God-sized tasks, even if it's in our personal lives or in our community as a church or as the body as a whole globally. And us on our own, the sum of our parts, the sum of Larry Bogen, his quiet time, his prayer time, his sleep schedule, his eating schedule, the sum of those parts isn't enough to do that, right? The sum of Park Heights Baptist Church, so our offering, our praise, our preaching, our staff, our people, isn't enough to do the thing that God calls us to do, right? The sum of our parts as Christians in America and in the UK, in the billions of Christians, isn't enough to do what God calls us to do. And God says, exactly, it's set up like that on purpose. Because what you're called to do is obedience. What I'm called to do as your leader is provide. We'll close out with this wonderful illustration that fits in, right? back in the Old Testament, I've been going through the Old Testament for Bible Times, and I just went through Judges. And Judges is great because I think a lot of times we look at the Old Testament and they're like, yeah, they're all awesome. But then you read like Judges or you read the life of David, and you're like, man, that guy was an idiot. Geez, I wouldn't be making that mistake, and you're making that mistake in your life while you're reading about those judges, especially Samson. But we won't get into Samson. We're talking about Gideon. So Gideon was this guy who he was the prophet. I think he was the third prophet and the third judge in. And God says to Gideon, "You are going to overtake these people who are over you, your masters." And Gideon's like, "I don't think that's possible. I'm terrified." Right? And Gideon struggles with fear throughout his entire time as a prophet, as a judge, right? And God, through a series of miracles, convinces Gideon to obey him, right? And Gideon is terrible, to borrow a phrase from the kids, he's shook, and he cobbles together like 32,000 Israelites to fight off several hundred thousand of their captors. And he's got them all together, and God says to Gideon, "No, you've got too many people." Gideon's like, "Dude, we're like 10-1, God. What are you talking about? We got too many people." And God says, "All right, why don't you send some people home?" And Gideon's like, "Okay." He gets up. "All right, anybody who doesn't want to be here, they can go." All right. And 10,000 men, or pardon me, all but 10,000 leave. So they got 10,000 left. And Gideon is aging. This isn't in here, but I'm sure he has ulcers right now. If I was Gideon, my hair would be falling out, and I would have such bad psoriasis, because I have that right now, under stress, right? So anyways, Gideon's like, "All right, let's get this over with, Lord." And God says, "Not so fast. We still have too many." And Gideon's like, "What? Could you repeat that again, please? I think I have something in my ear. You said we have too many." And God says, "Yeah. Send them down to the creek, have everyone drink. If they lap like a dog, they can stick around. If they drink with their hand, they got to go home." A lot of people overanalyze that. All God's doing here is winnowing out to bring it down to the final number that Gideon has to fight hundreds of thousands of people, 300. Gideon's 300, right? And Gideon's like, "What is going on?" And the Lord says, "The reason we're down to 300 and you have a bunch of pots and some candles and some trumpets, because that's what they used to win the war, is we wanted to be clear that the only person who brought Israel out of her captivity was her God." So presumably dumbfounded, Gideon goes, "Okay, so what are we going to do?" So they go and they sneak out in the dark of night, and they put lanterns on top of their candles, and the candles are lit. And at once they yell, "The sword of the Lord," in of Gideon, and they crash their lanterns and they blow the trumpets, and all the lights come up, and it looks like a whole host. And in Judges, you can read it. They were confused and frightened, and the army started swinging, and they just hit themselves because there was only 300 people. They largely killed themselves, and they ran, and they were scared. And the worst thing you can have is the yips in battle, is being in your own head, and they lose. And Gideon could not have pulled it off with 32,000 people. Couldn't have pulled it off with 100,000 people. The Lord pulled it off with 300 and an apprehensive leader. Right? So you go back, all right, well, what are you telling me? Well, what we see here is that God gives us weaknesses on purpose. And God calls us to obey him in those weaknesses on purpose. Because the point of the Christian life isn't to be successful or look good. The point of the Christian life is to glorify God. Right? And I love it because we just live this. I'll probably sing this praise forever as your pastor here, or as long as he'll allow me. But we just did this with our community resource center, didn't we? Yeah. We were running 40 people, including kids. Offerings were down. We had to cut a third of our budget. Right? These are all things that happen. These are undeniable. But we got to share the gospel with 100+ people. And we got to feed them well. And many people in our church went fed because of that. You know what that is as a church? That's glorifying God in our weakness. Here's the thing. I've had many of those experiences in my life. And those of you who are our senior saints who've been here a while, you've had many of those experiences in your life where it just doesn't make sense to obey. You don't know how it's going to turn out, but you're going to lean in and you're going to honor God anyways. And somehow, by no other reasonable explanation other than, as the insurance companies would call, an act of God, does it work? And the reason it works is because in the promise that Jesus makes to Paul, and it's the same promise that Jesus makes to not only myself, Larry Bogen, or you all individually, but also as Christians and also us as a group of Christians as Park Heights Baptist Church, is that I, Jesus, will be glorified and perfected my power in your weakness. It is okay to be weak, because when we admit that we are weak, that means we have no choice but to lean on the everlasting arms of our Father. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for the fact that our little snafu was a false alarm. Thank you so much for the fact that we are weak, and because we're weak, you're strong. Thank you so much for the fact that I, Larry Bogen, will never be enough, because that means you have to be enough, and that takes a load off my shoulders. I want to pray right now for our congregation that you help us learn that. Pray right now for the younger members of our congregation that you help us learn that, because a lot of times for us, it's more of a statement of faith than a reality that we've lived. Lord, please bless us as we worship you. Thanks and love. In your name I pray, amen. Brad, what are we playing?